army that spends its time pillaging and molesting the population is probably not an effective fighting army. So it's a part of the creation of a new military discipline, which is another whole story. So in some sense, the rules of war, the laws of war, the restraints on what soldiers can do in war is a function of military necessity as much as of humanitarian sentiment. So the growth of armies, the complexity of armies, brings with it, in some sense, a need to regulate the behavior of the armies from the point of view of the people who are owning the armies, of the commanders. Question? Please wave your hand. So, just to give you some sense of the context, this was a war in which the artists and literary people and politicians understood that they were reaching a new and unmanageable level of violence. So, unmanageable not just from the position of the civilians, but as I say, also the army. So this is one of the most famous, before the great Goya horrors of war. This man Caillot was a French artist, an engraver, who lived in an area between France and Germany, which was an important war zone. And he did a series of these pictures on the ravages of war. And this is obviously not all of this is happening in one house. It's a sketch. But what you see here, soldiers are killing a peasant to try to steal what's going on. They're torturing someone. They're torturing someone here. They're molesting a woman there. In other words, these are soldiers out of control, which is not in the interest of the commander, as well as manifestly not in the interest of the people whose property is being destroyed. So, just to give you another sense, these were big-time sieges with very large armies, in which many of the cities of Germany, in particular, were burnt to the ground. A third of the civilian population of Germany died during these wars. So, new kind of warfare creates a demand for a regulation of war. Now, the second big next step in the laws of war, which are important to the 18th century, is Grotius, and you read some of Grotius in your reader. Grotius basically argues that there's a common law among nations which applies in war, and the rules which he basically sets out for these common law of war is the following, and it's still echoed in modern rules. The justice in war. Let me backtrack. We're going to come to a second to the notion that there's justice in going into war, and there's the law having to do with being with actually how the war is conducted, and I'll come back to this in just a second. So he says, in actual warfare, soldiers are not justified in doing anything in the war that's not actually part of furthering the particular war aim, the point of the war, which is what in the Geneva Conventions are called military necessity. So for an action to be legal in war, an action has to be instrumental to fulfilling the purposes of that war, which are themselves said to be just. So what these guys did in this house is irrelevant to the war, and henceforth is criminal. So Grotius set out this principle that what matters and that the law of war is basically the law, yes, of the necessity of war, but that chives off a great number of actions that aren't relevant and are consequently illegal. No, I'm sorry. I want to now go back to another context. The third, I guess maybe for the modern story, the most important version is this man, Francis Lieber, who was a German who lived in the United States, and was asked by General Grant, the commander of Union forces, in 1863, to write what became the first modern jus in bellum, that is, a law in war, law of war. The general context of this, which is important, is that in the American Civil War, unlike civil wars I'll talk to you about in a moment, the sides treat each other by and large as if they were real belligerent nations, with the responsibility of belligerent nations one to the other. And so Lieber wrote this set of regulations, which more or less maps on the Geneva Conventions, the first Geneva Conventions, the Hague Convention, and the later Geneva Conventions. So the American Civil War is which has a national law of war, to govern what the Union Army can do, became a foundation for international human law, what armies of other states can do. So the American Civil War is the comment. And Grant is interested in doing this, of course, because he didn't want to treat the South as if it were an ultimate enemy. That is to say, they wanted to treat it as if it were another country. So what does Lieber actually say in this? Well, what he says is, and I just read you a few parts of this text because you'll see this in the modern story. The law of war does not only disclaim all cruelty and bad faith concerning engagements concluded with the enemy during the war, but also the breaking of stipulations solemnly contracted by the belligerents at time of peace and avowedly intended to remain in force in case of war between the contracting powers. So things you promise not to do with the idea that they would restrain you when you're in war, you really shouldn't do. Military necessity, it harkens back to Grotius, does not admit of cruelty. That is, the infliction of suffering for the sake of suffering, or for revenge, or for maiming, or for wounding, except in a fight. It doesn't admit the use of poison in any way. You can't wantonly destroy a district. Yes, the citizen of a hostile country can be an enemy, but only is treated as an enemy if they're actually hostile to you in a military situation. So Lieber, you get the idea of this. Lieber goes through all of these and says, basically, you need to treat the civilians of this other population as if they were non-combatants in every relevant respect, except under a situation where there's a manifest military necessity. So, no murder, no robbery, no pillaging, no sacking. And it's also the first rule which says explicitly no rape and no violence against women. And it makes rape and violence against women a capital offense for Union soldiers, which is the first time, as I know, that this enters into the jurisprudence of the law of war and becomes part of international jurisprudence, though honored much more in the breach. Now, as I say, that then is a really important document that gets you into the Geneva and the Hague Conventions and the 19th century jurisprudence that I talked to you about. Can you stop here for a second? Any queries about this? Queries. I'm sorry? Say it again?
At some point, the United States reversed its view on enemies of population of other nations being our enemy. We still treat them as non-combatants, but it's codified in American law that if we're at war with another nation, we're at war with the other nation entirely. Which is why you can be charged with treason for saying things in support of the other nation, things like that, even if you're a non-combatant, even if you're a civilian.
Right. I don't know enough about. I'm going to ask Lars actually to speak a little bit at the end of the class because he's been involved has been and will again be involved in Afghanistan, and there's a really interesting distinction between the rules of engagement and the laws of war, which I'd like to talk about at the end. But the question is, it was also true in this war, in the Civil War. was there your enemy in this? It says that you're your enemy, but you can only treat them as an enemy, as not a civilian, if they actually do something that's aggressively hostile. I don't think that speaking, unless it's meant to cause action, is a reason for violating the rights of a civilian.